In the brutal winter of 1888, when temperatures dropped so low that breath froze before it left your lips and survival measured itself in minutes rather than hours, the Colorado Rockies became a frozen wasteland that claimed the lives of even the most experienced mountain men. For Marcus Blackwood, a former cavalry scout who had retreated to the wilderness after losing everything he held dear, these mountains represented both sanctuary and penance, a place where a man could disappear from the world and the world could forget him in return. But on the morning of February 15th, when the wind howled through the peaks with the fury of 1,000 demons, and snow fell so thick it erased the very landscape, Marcus would discover that some things refused to stay buried in the frozen silence of the high country. Following what should have been a routine trap line through the dense pine forests above Winter Haven, he would stumble upon a sight that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude and thrust him into a deadly game of survival, secrets, and justice that would test everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The woman he found half dead in a makeshift sled, her elegant traveling clothes torn and blood-stained, her dark hair matted with ice, and her gray eyes holding secrets that could topple the most powerful man in 3 counties, would whisper words that changed everything. For Elena Hartwell was not just any victim of the merciless Colorado winter. She was the daughter of Judge Cornelius Hartwell, the most feared and respected judicial authority in the territory. And what she had discovered about her father's true nature would either bring justice to a lawless land or get them both killed in the attempt. The thermometer outside Marcus Blackwood's cabin read 23 degrees below zero when he stepped into the pre-dawn darkness of February 15th, 1888. At 41, Marcus had spent the last 9 years learning to read the mountain's moods, and this morning the peaks whispered of death. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, and the snow that had been falling for 3 days showed no signs of stopping. Any sensible man would have stayed by his fire, but Marcus had never been accused of being sensible. Not since the day he'd lost his wife and daughter to a typhoid epidemic and decided that solitude was preferable to the pain of human connection. His trap lines extended 15 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Colorado Rockies, following game trails that wound between granite cliffs and through forests so dense that noon felt like twilight. It was dangerous work in good weather and potentially suicidal in conditions like these, but the furs he collected represented his only connection to the outside world, the one commodity that forced him to make monthly trips to Winter Haven to trade for supplies. Marcus strapped on his snowshoes and shouldered his rifle, checking the loads in his Colt revolver out of habit learned during his cavalry days. The wind cut through his heavy coat like a blade, and he pulled his wool scarf higher over his face as he set out along the familiar trail. Behind him, his cabin disappeared into the swirling snow within 50 yards, swallowed by a wilderness that had no mercy for the unprepared or unlucky. The first trap yielded a decent-sized beaver, its brown fur thick and valuable. The second held nothing but wind and snow. By the time Marcus reached the third station, nearly 4 miles from his cabin, the storm had intensified to the point where he could barely see his own feet. Ice crystals had formed in his beard, and his fingers were growing numb despite his heavy gloves. Common sense dictated that he turn back, but something deeper than logic kept him moving forward along the trail. It was at the fourth trap, positioned beside a frozen stream in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, that Marcus first heard the sound that would change his life forever. At first he thought it was just the wind moaning through the trees, but as he bent to check his snare, the sound came again, a low, keening cry that was unmistakably human. Someone was out there in the storm, and from the weakness of the voice they were in serious trouble. Marcus stood and cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting as loud as he could manage. "Hello, where are you?" His voice was swallowed almost immediately by the wind, but the crying stopped, replaced by what might have been an answering call. He abandoned his trap and struck out toward the sound, following his ears rather than any visible trail through snow that came up to his knees. What he found 30 yards deeper into the forest stopped him in his tracks. A makeshift sled, clearly crafted in desperation from pine branches and leather strips, sat tilted against a fallen log. Huddled beneath what appeared to be a traveling cloak and several blankets was a young woman, her face pale as the snow around her, and her lips tinged blue with cold. Her dark hair was matted with ice, and when she opened her gray eyes to look at him, Marcus saw a mixture of hope and terror that spoke of experiences no lady should have endured. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please." Marcus didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he scooped her up from the sled, blankets and all, and cradled her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel her body shaking with hypothermia through the layers of fabric. Her elegant traveling dress, now torn and stained with blood, was completely inadequate for mountain weather. Whatever had brought her to this frozen hell, it hadn't been a planned journey. "I've got you," he said, though he doubted she could hear him over the storm. "You're going to be all right." The trip back to his cabin became a race against time and weather. Marcus knew the signs of severe hypothermia, and this woman was displaying all of them. Her shivering had become irregular, her speech was slurred, and her skin was taking on the waxy appearance that preceded frostbite. Even if he could get her to warmth and shelter within the next hour, there was no guarantee she would survive. Fighting through snow that seemed determined to drag him down, Marcus pressed forward along a trail that was rapidly disappearing under the fresh snowfall. His own extremities were beginning to go numb, and twice he stumbled over hidden obstacles that sent him to his knees. But each time, he struggled back to his feet and continued moving, driven by a protective instinct he thought had died with his family 9 years earlier. When the dim outline of his cabin finally appeared through the snow, Marcus felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. He kicked open the door and carried the woman inside, immediately setting her down near the large stone fireplace where coals still glowed from the morning's fire. Moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned wilderness medicine the hard way, he began the delicate process of warming her without shocking her system. First, he built up the fire until it roared with enough heat to warm the entire cabin. Then he carefully removed her wet outer garments, noting the quality of the fabric and the obvious expense of her clothing. This was no pioneer woman or settler's wife. Her dress was silk and fine wool, the kind of garments worn by the wealthy families of Denver or Colorado Springs. What was a woman of obvious means doing alone in the mountains in the middle of a blizzard? As he wrapped her in every dry blanket he owned and began forcing warm broth between her lips, Marcus studied her face more carefully. Even unconscious and pale with cold, she was strikingly beautiful, with the kind of refined features that spoke of good breeding and education. But there was something else in her face, even in unconsciousness, a tension around her eyes that suggested someone carrying a heavy burden. It took nearly 3 hours of constant attention before her color began to improve, and her breathing became more regular. When she finally opened her eyes around noon, they were clearer and more focused than before, though still shadowed with fear. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger than the whisper he'd heard in the forest. "My cabin, about 15 miles north of Winter Haven." Marcus handed her a cup of hot tea. "I found you in the woods, half frozen. What's your name?" She hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Elena. Elena Hartwell." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Hartwell. Judge Cornelius Hartwell of Winter Haven, the most powerful man in 3 counties, known for his iron-fisted control of law and order in the territory. A man whose word was law and whose judgment was never questioned. What was his daughter doing alone in a blizzard, miles from any settlement? "Judge Hartwell's daughter," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Fear flickered across Elena's features, and she glanced toward the door as if calculating whether she had the strength to run. "Yes, and I suppose that changes things." Why would it change things? "Because my father has enemies, people who might see taking his daughter as a way to get revenge." She pulled the blankets closer around herself. "I understand if you can't help me. I understand if you turn me over to them." "Turn you over to who?" Marcus asked. But Elena had closed her eyes and seemed to be fighting back tears. "The men who are hunting me," she whispered. "The men my father sent to kill me." The statement hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Judge Cornelius Hartwell was many things: stern, uncompromising, feared by criminals throughout the territory. But the idea that he would send men to kill his own daughter seemed impossible to believe. "Your father sent men to kill you?" Marcus asked carefully. "That's a serious accusation." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "3 days ago, I would have agreed with you. I would have said my father was the most honorable man in Colorado territory, a pillar of justice and moral authority." She accepted another cup of tea with hands that still trembled. "But 3 days ago, I didn't know what kind of man he really was." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, his rifle within easy reach. 9 years of mountain living had taught him to be suspicious of strangers, especially those with stories that seemed too dramatic to be true. But the genuine terror in Elena's eyes was difficult to fake, and the fact that she'd been found half dead in a blizzard suggested that someone had been trying very hard to ensure she didn't survive to tell her story. "What happened 3 days ago?" Elena stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "I went to my father's study to return a book I'd borrowed. The door was slightly open, and I could hear voices inside, my father's and several others I didn't recognize. They were discussing the Brennan family." Marcus knew the name. The Brennans had owned a prosperous ranch 15 miles south of Winter Haven until last autumn, when they'd been found dead in their burned-out house. Judge Hartwell had ruled it an accidental fire, caused by a knocked-over lamp during a family argument. The case had been closed quickly, with little investigation. "I should have left immediately," Elena continued, "but something in their tone made me stop and listen. They were talking about how to dispose of the Brennan property, how to divide the profits from the land sale." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And then my father said something about the children, about how they'd screamed when the fire started." "What exactly did he say?" "He laughed. He actually laughed when one of the other men described how little Mary Brennan had tried to crawl under her bed to escape the flames." Elena's hands clenched into fists. "They murdered that entire family, Marcus. Parents, 3 children, even the grandmother. All for a piece of land that could be sold to the railroad." Marcus felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. The Brennan case had troubled him at the time. The family had been well-liked and successful, with no known enemies or financial troubles. But Judge Hartwell's investigation had been swift and conclusive, and no one had dared question his findings. "You're certain about what you heard?" "I heard every detail. How they barred the doors so no one could escape. How they poured coal oil around the house to make sure it burned quickly. How they waited in the trees to make sure there were no survivors." Elena wiped tears from her cheeks. "They planned it for weeks, waiting for the right night when there would be no witnesses." "How did they know you were listening?" "I tried to back away from the door, but I knocked over a vase in the hallway. It shattered, and everyone in the study went silent." Elena shuddered at the memory. "My father came to the door and saw me standing there. The look on his face, it was like he was seeing a stranger, or a problem that needed to be solved." "What did you do?" "I ran to my room and pretended I'd been sleeping. When my father came to check on me, I acted confused about the noise, said I'd just woken up from a bad dream." She pulled the blankets tighter around herself. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. He knew that I'd heard everything. Marcus stood and moved to the window, peering through the shutters at the storm outside. The snow was still falling heavily, and visibility was near zero. If men were tracking Elena, the weather would make their job nearly impossible, but it would also make escape equally difficult. "How did you get away from Winter Haven?" "I waited until the next morning, then told my father I was going to visit my friend Sarah Morrison in Silver Creek. He seemed relieved that I was leaving town." Elena's voice grew bitter. "Of course he was planning to have me killed on the road, where it would look like an accident." "How do you know?" "Because they caught up with me 5 miles out of town, 3 men on horseback, including Deputy Marshal Crawford. They said my father had changed his mind about my trip, that I needed to come back to Winter Haven immediately." Marcus turned back from the window. "But you didn't go back." I could see it in their eyes. They had the same look my father had when he found me listening at his study door. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I told them I needed to retrieve something from my traveling bag, then broke a bottle over Crawford's head and ran into the forest." "How did you end up with that sled?" "I found it at an abandoned trapper's shelter about 10 miles north of where they caught me. Someone had left supplies there. Rope, tools, some old blankets. I thought if I could make it to the next settlement, I could find help. She laughed bitterly. I didn't count on the blizzard. Marcus studied Elena's face in the firelight, looking for signs of deception. Her story was almost too dramatic to believe, but the details were too specific and her fear too genuine to be fabricated. More importantly, it explained several things that had puzzled him about recent events in Winter Haven. The speed with which certain property cases had been resolved, the way some investigations had been closed without adequate examination of evidence. Why should I believe you, he asked. You could be making this up to get my help for some other reason. Because you knew the Brennan family, Elena said quietly. I can see it in your face. You knew they were good people who didn't deserve what happened to them. She met his eyes directly. And because deep down, you've always suspected that something was wrong in Winter Haven. Too many convenient accidents, too many cases closed without proper investigation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, remembering Thomas Brennan's honest face and the way little Mary Brennan had waved to him during his last visit to town. If what Elena was saying was true, those children had died terrified and alone, murdered for nothing more than money and land. Even if I believe you, he said finally, what can we do about it? Your father is the law in this territory. He has deputies, connections, influence that reaches all the way to Denver. One man's word against his won't be enough. It's not just one man's word, Elena said. I know where my father keeps his private papers, including correspondence with the men who helped him plan the murders. There's evidence that could bring down his entire operation. She leaned forward intensely. But only if we can get to it before he destroys it. We? I can't do this alone, Marcus. I need someone who knows the mountains, someone who can help me get back to Winter Haven without being caught. Her gray eyes pleaded with him. I know it's dangerous. I know I'm asking you to risk your life for someone you barely know. But those children deserve justice. Marcus walked to the window again, staring out at the storm that had brought Elena to his cabin. For 9 years, he'd avoided exactly this kind of situation. The messy complications of human emotions and moral obligations. But the image of Mary Brennan's frightened face wouldn't leave his mind, and he found himself thinking about his own daughter, who would have been about the same age. There's something else, Elena said softly. Something I haven't told you about why my father wants me dead. Marcus turned back to face her. What? The men in his study that night, they weren't just talking about the Brennan murders. They were planning more killings, a list of property owners whose land they want for railroad development. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Your name was on that list, Marcus. They're planning to kill you too. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the relentless howling of the wind outside. Marcus felt as if the floor had shifted beneath his feet, and he had to grip the back of his chair to steady himself. His name on a death list. It should have seemed impossible, but it explained too many things that had puzzled him over the past few months. My name, he said slowly. You're certain? Elena nodded grimly. They called you the hermit with the valuable timber rights. Someone had done research on your property. They knew exactly how much your land was worth and where it was located relative to the proposed railroad route. Marcus's mind raced through recent events with new understanding. The suspicious men he'd spotted watching his cabin from distant ridges. The unusual number of lost travelers who had asked detailed questions about his property boundaries. The casual inquiries from townspeople about whether he ever planned to sell his land and move back to civilization. When? He asked. They were planning to wait until spring, when travel would be easier. Something about making it look like an accident during a hunting trip. Elena pulled the blankets closer around herself. But now that I've escaped and you've helped me, they'll probably move faster. My father doesn't like loose ends. Marcus walked to his gun cabinet and began methodically checking his weapons. If Judge Hartwell's men were coming for him, he wanted to be ready. His military training had never completely faded, even after 9 years of peaceful mountain living. How many men does your father have working for him? At least a dozen that I know of. Some are official deputies, others are hired guns who work for the men financing his land schemes. Elena watched him prepare his arsenal with growing alarm. Marcus, we can't fight them all. Our only chance is to expose the truth before they can silence us permanently. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Even if we could get back to Winter Haven without being caught, your father's study will be guarded. Getting to his papers would be suicide. Not necessarily. Elena's voice grew more confident. I know my father's routines, his habits, his security arrangements. More importantly, I know someone in town who might help us. Someone who has his own reasons for wanting to see justice done. Who? Dr. Samuel Morrison. He's been suspicious about some of the deaths he's been asked to examine, particularly the Brennan case. I've seen the questions in his eyes during the inquest, the way he hesitates before signing death certificates. Elena leaned forward. He's a good man, Marcus. If we can convince him of the truth, he might be willing to help us gather evidence. Marcus considered this while he cleaned his rifle. Dr. Morrison had a reputation for integrity, but he also had a wife and children to protect. Asking him to go against Judge Hartwell would be asking him to risk everything. Even with Morrison's help, getting into your father's study would be nearly impossible. The courthouse is always guarded, and your family's house is probably under surveillance. But I know a way in that they wouldn't expect. Elena's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. There's a tunnel that connects the basement of our house to the courthouse basement. My father had it built years ago as an emergency escape route in case of Indian attacks or civil unrest. Very few people know about it. How do we get to the tunnel without being seen? The entrance in our house is hidden behind a bookshelf in the library. If we could get inside during one of my father's evening court sessions, when the house is empty except for servants, we might be able to access both his private papers and his courthouse records. Marcus set down his rifle and studied Elena's face carefully. Her plan was bold, possibly even feasible, but it would require perfect timing and considerable luck. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the safety of his mountain refuge and returning to a world of human complications he'd spent 9 years trying to avoid. Why me? He asked. You could try to reach the territorial capital, contact federal authorities who aren't under your father's influence. It would be safer than trying to gather evidence ourselves. Because by the time federal authorities could investigate, my father would have destroyed all the evidence and probably killed anyone who could testify against him. Elena's voice grew passionate. And because you're the only person I've met who has both the skills to help and the moral courage to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost, you don't know anything about my moral courage. I know you risked your life to save a stranger in a blizzard. I know you've listened to my story with an open mind instead of dismissing it or turning me over to the authorities. Elena met his eyes directly. And I know that you're thinking about those children right now, about Mary Brennan and her brothers, about whether they'll ever see justice if we don't act. Marcus turned away from her penetrating gaze and stared into the fire. She was right about the children. Their faces had been haunting him since she'd described their deaths, but he was also thinking about his own daughter, about the promise he'd made at her grave to never again let himself care enough about anyone to risk the kind of pain he'd endured when he lost his family. This isn't your fight, Elena said softly. I have no right to ask you to get involved, but I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anyone else to turn to, and because I think you're the kind of man who can't walk away when children have been murdered and their killers are walking free. Outside, the storm was beginning to show signs of weakening. The wind had dropped slightly and the snow was falling more gently. Within a day or two, travel would be possible again, which meant Elena would have to make a decision about what to do next. If I help you, Marcus said slowly, it's not going to be a rescue mission. It's going to be war. Your father and his associates won't hesitate to kill us both, and they'll have every advantage. Numbers, position, local support. The odds of success are slim, and the odds of survival are even worse. I understand. Do you? Because once we leave this cabin and start down this path, there's no going back. Either we expose your father's crimes and bring him to justice, or we die trying. There's no middle ground, no negotiation, no mercy for failure. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as she considered the full implications of what they were contemplating. When she spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. 3 days ago, I thought my father was a hero. I thought justice and law were the same thing, and that good people were always protected by the system. She looked up at Marcus with eyes that had aged years in the past few days. Now I know that sometimes justice has to be fought for by ordinary people who refuse to let evil triumph. Those children died screaming, Marcus. If we don't act, others will die the same way. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that his 9 years of peaceful isolation were about to end. Elena Hartwell had brought more than just a story to his cabin. She'd brought a choice between the safety of solitude and the dangerous obligation of moral action. And despite everything he'd told himself about avoiding human complications, he knew he couldn't walk away from murdered children any more than he could have left Elena to die in the snow. "All right," he said, "we'll try, but we do this my way with military precision and maximum caution. One mistake will get us both killed." Relief flooded Elena's face. "Thank you. Thank you for believing me, for being willing to help." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus warned. "Thank me if we're still alive when this is over." But even as he spoke, Marcus was already beginning to formulate a plan. It would be dangerous, probably suicidal, but it might just work. And if it did, Judge Cornelius Hartwell would learn that some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how much power and influence he wielded. The storm outside was weakening, but the real tempest was just beginning. Dawn of the third day brought a deceptive calm to the mountains. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a landscape transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the early sunlight. But Marcus knew better than to trust the peaceful appearance. Clear weather meant travel was possible again, and if Judge Hartwell's men were hunting Elena, they would resume their search with renewed determination. Marcus had spent the night planning their approach to Winter Haven, studying maps and considering every possible route through terrain he knew better than any man alive. The direct path would take them through open valleys, where they could be spotted from miles away. The safer mountain routes would add days to their journey and expose them to the risk of avalanches in the fresh snow. Every option carried significant dangers. "They'll be watching all the main trail," he told Elena as they prepared to leave. "Our only chance is to take the old Indian path through Dead Man's Canyon. It's treacherous in good weather and potentially suicidal after a storm like this, but it's the one route they won't expect us to use." Elena, now dressed in spare men's clothing that Marcus had adapted to fit her smaller frame, nodded with the determination that had carried her through 3 days of terror and survival. "How long will it take?" 2 days if we push hard and don't encounter any problems. 3 if we have to take detours around avalanche areas." Marcus shouldered his pack, heavy with supplies and ammunition. "The path follows a creek bed for most of the way, which will help hide our tracks, but it also means we'll be walking through snow and slush. You'll need to stay close and do exactly what I tell you." They set out just after sunrise, Marcus breaking trail on snowshoes while Elena followed in his footsteps. The first few miles took them through familiar territory around Marcus's cabin, but as they climbed higher into the peaks, the landscape became increasingly hostile. Massive drifts blocked traditional paths, forcing them to make dangerous traverses across steep slopes, where a single misstep could trigger an avalanche. The Indian path Marcus had chosen was barely visible under the snow, marked only by occasional blazes on trees and the subtle contours of the land that spoke to eyes trained in wilderness travel. It had been carved by Ute hunting parties decades earlier, following natural features that provided the most efficient passage through otherwise impassable terrain. But it had been abandoned for years, and winter storms had made it even more treacherous. They had been traveling for 3 hours when Marcus spotted the first signs of pursuit. From a high ridge overlooking the valley they had just crossed, he could make out dark figures moving across the white expanse below. At least 4 men on horseback, following a trail that would intersect with theirs within hours if they maintained their current pace. "They've found our tracks," Marcus told Elena, handing her his field glasses. "Probably picked them up near the cabin and have been following us since dawn." Elena studied the distant riders through the lenses, her face pale with recognition. "I can see Deputy Crawford. The man in the lead is Jake Morrison, one of my father's hired guns." She lowered the glasses with shaking hands. "They're not trying to capture me, Marcus. They're here to kill us both." Marcus had expected as much. Judge Hartwell couldn't afford to let either of them survive to tell their story, and the remote mountain location would allow his men to dispose of the bodies without risk of discovery. But pursuit on horseback would be difficult in the deep snow, giving them some advantage. "We need to reach the canyon before they catch up," Marcus said, increasing their pace. "Once we're in the narrows, horses won't be able to follow, and we'll have better defensive positions if it comes to a fight." The descent into Dead Man's Canyon was harrowing, even under ideal conditions. The path wound down a series of steep switchbacks carved into the canyon wall, with precipitous drops on one side and unstable rock faces on the other. Fresh snow had made the footing treacherous, and twice Elena slipped, saved only by Marcus's quick reflexes and the safety rope that connected them. Halfway down the canyon wall, they could hear voices echoing from above. Their pursuers had reached the rim and were debating whether to follow on foot or try to find another route around. Marcus pressed against the rock wall and motioned for Elena to remain silent as the voices grew clearer. "Trail goes right down the cliff face," one man called. "No way to get horses down there." "Then we go around," came the reply, a voice Marcus recognized as belonging to Deputy Crawford. "Circle back to the South Pass and cut them off when they come out the other end." "That'll take all day. They could be anywhere by then. Judge wants this done quiet and clean. We're not going down that death trap after them." Crawford's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Post a man here to watch for them coming back up, and we'll take the long way around." Marcus waited until the voices faded before continuing the descent. Crawford's decision to go around rather than follow directly gave them several hours' advantage, but it also meant they would face an ambush at the canyon's far end. The deputy knew the territory well enough to predict where they would emerge, and his men would be waiting. The floor of Dead Man's Canyon was a narrow gorge carved by centuries of rushing water, now frozen into a series of ice falls and snow-filled pools. Travel along the canyon floor was slower than Marcus had hoped, but it offered complete concealment from observation and would be impossible to navigate for anyone unfamiliar with the route. "Why is it called Dead Man's Canyon?" Elena asked as they picked their way around a particularly treacherous ice formation. "Ute legend says it's haunted by the spirits of warriors who died in a battle with cavalry troops 30 years ago," Marcus replied. "More practically, it's claimed the lives of several prospectors and hunters who tried to use it as a shortcut and got caught in flash floods or avalanches." As if summoned by his words, a deep rumbling echoed through the canyon, the sound of massive snow masses shifting high above them. Both Marcus and Elena froze, listening to determine whether the sound indicated an immediate avalanche threat or just the natural settling of storm-loaded slopes. "Keep moving," Marcus said after a tense moment, "but stay alert. All this fresh snow makes the whole area unstable." They had traveled nearly 4 miles through the canyon when Marcus spotted smoke rising in the distance, a thin column that marked human presence ahead of them. Through his field glasses, he could make out a crude shelter built against the canyon wall, with several figures moving around what appeared to be a campfire. "More of your father's men?" Marcus asked, handing Elena the glasses. She studied the distant camp carefully before shaking her head. "I don't recognize any of them. Could be trappers or prospectors taking shelter from the storm." But Marcus's instincts, honed by years of frontier living and military service, suggested otherwise. The shelter was positioned perfectly to observe anyone traveling through the canyon, and the men moved with the purposeful alertness of sentries rather than the casual behavior of innocent travelers. "We're walking into another trap," he told Elena. "Crawford was smarter than I gave him credit for. He sent men ahead to set up blocking positions while we were congratulating ourselves on avoiding pursuit." "What do we do?" Marcus studied the terrain ahead, looking for alternatives to the obvious route along the canyon floor. The walls rose nearly vertical on both sides, offering little opportunity for bypass, but there was a narrow ledge system on the north wall that might allow them to move past the shelter undetected. "We go up," he said, pointing to the barely visible ledge. "It's dangerous, but it's better than walking into their guns." The climb to the ledge system required all of Marcus's mountaineering skills and Elena's growing confidence in dangerous terrain. Using ropes and improvised anchors, they worked their way up the canyon wall until they reached a narrow shelf of rock that ran parallel to the canyon floor, 60 feet above the bottom. From their elevated position, they could observe the camp below without being seen. Marcus counted 5 men, all armed and positioned to cover the canyon's exit. They had clearly been expecting Elena and Marcus to arrive, which confirmed that this was a coordinated effort rather than a chance encounter. "We wait until dark," Marcus whispered. "Then we try to slip past them while they're sleeping." But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that their pursuers were not planning to sleep. The men below maintained active watch schedules, keeping the canyon under constant observation. More troubling, Marcus could see additional smoke signals rising from positions deeper in the canyon, evidence that the blocking force was larger and better organized than he had initially thought. As sunset approached, painting the canyon walls with shades of red and gold, Marcus made a difficult decision. They couldn't wait for the men below to leave or relax their vigilance, and trying to slip past undetected was becoming increasingly unlikely to succeed. "We're going to have to fight our way out," he told Elena. "I'm going to create a distraction while you work your way to the far end of the ledge. When you hear shooting, move as fast as you can toward the canyon exit. I won't leave you to face them alone." "You will if you want to see justice done for those children," Marcus replied firmly. "I can hold them off long enough for you to escape, but only if you don't try to help. Promise me you'll run when I tell you to." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I promise. But Marcus, after this is over, after we expose my father's crimes, I want you to know that meeting you has restored my faith in human decency." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Their pursuers from the rim had arrived to reinforce the blocking position, and any chance of slipping past undetected was now gone completely. "Change of plans," Marcus said grimly, checking his weapons one final time. "We're not waiting for dark." The attack came with the precision of military strategy and the desperation of cornered prey. Marcus had learned during his cavalry days that the best defense was often an unexpected offense, and his plan relied on surprise, superior position, and the enemy's assumption that he and Elena would try to avoid confrontation rather than seek it. From their position on the ledge, Marcus had a clear view of the camp below and excellent cover behind a series of large boulders. His first shot took out the sentry posted nearest to the canyon wall, the crack of his rifle echoing off the rock walls like thunder. Before the other men could locate the source of the shot, Marcus had already moved to a new position and fired again. The camp erupted into chaos as men scrambled for cover, shouting conflicting orders and firing wildly at shadows. Marcus used their confusion to work his way along the ledge, picking his shots carefully and making every bullet count. His years of mountain living had made him an expert marksman, and the elevated position gave him significant tactical advantage. But the advantage couldn't last forever. Deputy Crawford arrived with reinforcements just as Marcus was running low on ammunition, and the newcomers quickly organized a coordinated response. Rifle fire began chipping away at his cover, forcing him to keep his head down while the enemy worked their way closer. "Blackwood!" Crawford's voice boomed through the canyon. "We know you're up there. Send down the girl, and we might let you live." Marcus didn't bother to respond. He could see Elena moving carefully along the far end of the ledge, working her way toward a place where she could descend safely and continue toward the canyon exit. Every minute he could keep the gunman focused on him was another minute for her to get closer to safety. A bullet whined off the rock inches from his face, followed immediately by two more. The men below were getting better organized, using coordinated fire to keep him pinned, while others climbed toward his position. Marcus shifted to a new spot behind the boulders and returned fire, but he could feel the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Elena's voice calling out from somewhere behind him. "Stop shooting! I'm coming down!" Marcus spun around to see Elena climbing back toward the main ledge, her hands raised in surrender. She had abandoned her escape route and was walking directly into the trap he'd been trying to help her avoid. "Elena, no!" he shouted, but she was already beyond his reach. "Let him go!" she called to the men below. "I'm the one you want. Marcus Blackwood doesn't know anything. He just found me in the snow." Crawford's laughter echoed through the canyon. "That's real touching, Miss Hartwell, but you're both going to die. The only question is whether it's quick or slow." Elena reached the main ledge and began working her way down toward the canyon floor, moving carefully but deliberately. Marcus realized with growing horror that she was sacrificing herself in a desperate attempt to save his life, an act of selfless courage that reminded him painfully of the kind of person his late wife had been. But Elena's sacrifice also created an opportunity. With the gunman focused on her descent, Marcus was able to move to a new position that gave him a clear shot at Crawford and his companions. He had perhaps 30 seconds before Elena reached the bottom, and the deputy's attention returned to eliminating witnesses. Marcus made his choice with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through years of frontier warfare. Rising from cover, he opened fire with devastating accuracy, his rifle speaking again and again as he worked through the remaining ammunition. 3 men fell in quick succession before the others could react, including Crawford himself, who pitched forward into the snow with a look of surprise frozen on his face. The sudden loss of their leader sent the remaining gunmen into panic. Some returned fire wildly while others sought better cover, but their coordination was broken and their tactical advantage was gone. Marcus continued his methodical shooting, making every shot count as he eliminated threats and protected Elena's position. When the echoes of gunfire finally faded, 4 men lay dead in the snow, and the 5th was crawling away with a shattered shoulder, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of wind through the rocks and Elena's labored breathing as she completed her descent to the canyon floor. "Why did you come back?" Marcus demanded as he climbed down to join her. "You were almost clear." "Because I couldn't live with myself if you died trying to save me," Elena replied simply, "and because we're stronger together than apart." Marcus wanted to argue, but the practical situation demanded immediate attention. They had eliminated the immediate threat, but gunfire echoed for miles in mountain terrain, and other pursuit parties would be converging on their location. They needed to move quickly if they hoped to reach Winter Haven before additional reinforcements arrived. "Can you travel?" he asked, checking Elena for injuries. "I'm fine. But what about him?" She pointed to the wounded gunman who was still crawling away through the snow. Marcus considered the tactical implications. Leaving the man alive meant he could report their location and direction of travel to other pursuit parties. But shooting a wounded man in cold blood went against everything Marcus believed in, despite the pragmatic arguments for eliminating a potential threat. "He's not going anywhere fast with that shoulder," Marcus decided. "By the time he reaches help, we'll either be dead or have accomplished our mission." They gathered what ammunition and supplies they could carry from the defeated gunmen, then resumed their journey through the canyon. Elena moved with new confidence, her successful gamble having proved that courage and quick thinking could overcome superior numbers and position. But Marcus remained alert for additional threats, knowing that Judge Hartwell would not give up easily. The exit from Dead Man's Canyon emerged onto a high plateau that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. In the distance, Marcus could see the smoke of Winter Haven rising from the valley below. Their destination was finally within reach. But between them and the town lay 15 miles of open terrain, where they would be visible to anyone watching for their approach. "We'll have to wait for darkness," Marcus said, studying the route through his field glasses. "Too much open ground to cross in daylight." As they found shelter among a cluster of wind-carved rocks, Elena pulled out a small leather journal and began writing with quick, precise movements. Marcus watched her work, curious about what could be so important that she would take time to write in their current circumstances. "Evidence," she explained without looking up. "Everything I can remember about the conversation I overheard, details about the men involved, descriptions of the documents I saw in my father's study." She continued writing as she spoke. "If something happens to me before we can reach the authorities, you'll have a record of what we discovered." Marcus nodded, understanding the wisdom of creating multiple copies of their evidence. But he was also struck by Elena's methodical approach to their dangerous situation. Despite everything she had endured, she was thinking like an investigator rather than a victim, building a case that could survive even if they didn't. As darkness fell over the Colorado Rockies, Marcus and Elena prepared for the final stage of their journey to Winter Haven. They had survived pursuit, gunfights, and mountain weather, but the most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead. Judge Hartwell would be waiting for them in his stronghold, surrounded by loyal deputies and hired guns who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone threatening their corrupt empire. But they also carried something that had been missing from the territory for too long: the truth about murdered families and the evidence needed to bring their killers to justice. Whether they lived or died in the attempt, the secret Elena had whispered in the snow was about to change everything. The approach to Winter Haven under cover of darkness felt like descending into the mouth of hell itself. Marcus and Elena moved through shadows cast by a half-moon, staying to the tree lines and avoiding the main roads, where patrols might be watching for their arrival. The town below looked deceptively peaceful, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that gave no hint of the corruption and murder that festered beneath its respectable facade. Marcus had spent hours studying the town's layout through his field glasses, noting the positions of guards and the patterns of patrol movements. Judge Hartwell had turned Winter Haven into an armed camp, with deputies posted at every major intersection and suspicious strangers being questioned at gunpoint. Getting into the town undetected would require all of Marcus's military training and considerable luck. "There," Elena whispered, pointing to a large house on the hill overlooking the main street. "That's my family's home. The library with the tunnel entrance is on the ground floor, facing the garden." Marcus studied the house through his glasses, noting the guards posted at the front and rear entrances. Light showed in several windows, including what appeared to be Judge Hartwell's study, suggesting that Elena's father was working late, probably coordinating the search for his missing daughter. "2 guards that I can see, possibly more inside," Marcus reported. "How do we get past them?" "There's a servant's entrance on the east side that's usually only watched during the day," Elena said. "If we can reach the garden wall, there's a trellis I used to climb when I was younger. It leads to my bedroom window." The plan that emerged was desperate but potentially workable. Elena would use her knowledge of the house to get them inside, while Marcus provided security and watched for patrols. Once they reached the library and accessed the tunnel system, they would have a direct route to the courthouse and Judge Hartwell's private files. But first, they needed to reach Dr. Morrison and convince him to help them. Without a trusted witness to verify their evidence, even the most damning documents could be dismissed as forgeries or fabrications. Morrison's medical expertise and reputation for honesty would give credibility to their accusations. The doctor's house was located on a quiet side street, away from the main commercial district where most of the patrols were concentrated. Marcus and Elena approached through back alleys and residential gardens, moving from shadow to shadow like ghosts returning from the grave. Dr. Morrison answered their quiet knock personally, probably expecting a late-night medical emergency. His expression shifted from professional concern to shock and fear as he recognized Elena in the lamplight. "Miss Hartwell, we heard you were dead, killed in the blizzard." He looked past her to Marcus, taking in his armed and dangerous appearance. "Who is this man? What's happening?" "Dr. Morrison, I need your help," Elena said urgently. "May we come in?" "It's not safe to talk in the open." Morrison hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between curiosity and self-preservation, then stepped aside to let them enter. His home was modest but comfortable, filled with medical books and the tools of his profession. A fire burned in the hearth, and the smell of coffee suggested he had been working late. "I don't understand," Morrison said as they settled in his study. "Your father said you died in an avalanche while traveling to Silver Creek. There was a memorial service yesterday." "My father lied," Elena said simply. "He tried to have me killed because I overheard him planning murder." She proceeded to tell Morrison everything she had discovered about the Brennan family killings, speaking with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the facts many times during their mountain journey. Morrison's face grew pale as Elena described the conversation she had overheard, particularly the details about how the family had died. As the town's physician, he had been required to examine the bodies and sign the death certificates, and Elena's account clearly matched observations he had been reluctant to discuss publicly. "I knew something was wrong," Morrison said quietly. "The burn patterns, the way the bodies were positioned, it didn't match what you'd expect from an accidental fire." He looked up at Elena with haunted eyes. But Judge Hartwell was so certain about his findings, and he had such detailed explanations for everything I questioned. "Because he knew exactly what had happened," Elena said. "He planned every detail." Marcus had remained silent during Elena's explanation, but now he leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had seen too much violence. "Doctor, we have a chance to expose this corruption and bring the killers to justice. But we need your help to make the evidence credible." "What kind of help?" "We're going to break into the courthouse tonight and steal Judge Hartwell's private correspondence," Marcus said bluntly. "When we do, we'll need a trusted witness to verify what we find and testify to federal authorities." Morrison stood and walked to his window, staring out at the town he had served faithfully for 15 years. "You're asking me to commit treason against the most powerful man in the territory. If you're wrong, or if this plan fails, my family will pay the price. If we're right and we do nothing, more families will die," Elena replied. "My father has a list of property owners marked for elimination. The Brennans were just the beginning." The doctor was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with a decision that would change his life regardless of which choice he made. When he finally turned back to face them, his expression was resolved. "I've been carrying the guilt of those death certificates for months," he said. "If there's a chance to make things right, I have to take it." He moved to a desk and began writing rapidly. "I'm preparing affidavits describing my medical findings and my suspicions about the Brennan deaths. If something happens to me tonight, these documents will serve as my testimony." While Morrison worked, Marcus and Elena finalized their plan for entering the courthouse. The tunnel Elena had described would allow them to bypass the guards, but they would need to move quickly once they were inside. Judge Hartwell's private office would contain the most sensitive correspondence, but it would also be the most likely place for additional security measures. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked Elena as they prepared to leave Morrison's house. "I've been ready since the moment I heard my father laugh about murdered children," she replied. "Tonight we settle accounts." The journey to Elena's family home took them through the heart of Winter Haven, past shops and businesses that had seemed so normal during Marcus's previous visits to town. Now, knowing what he did about the corruption that controlled every aspect of local government, the familiar buildings felt like facades hiding a fundamental evil. The climb up the garden trellis to Elena's bedroom window proved easier than expected, though Marcus's weight tested the aged wood to its limits. Elena's room was exactly as she had left it, with clothes still laid out and books stacked beside her bed. For a moment, she paused to touch familiar objects, probably wondering if she would ever see them again. The route to the library took them through darkened hallways, lined with family portraits, generations of Hartwells who had built their reputation on law and justice. Elena stopped briefly before a painting of her grandfather, a respected territorial judge who had helped establish the legal framework that his son was now corrupting for personal gain. "He would be ashamed," she whispered. The library was a large room filled with legal texts and literary classics, its walls lined floor to ceiling with carefully organized volumes. Elena moved to a particular section of shelving and pressed a hidden mechanism, causing an entire bookcase to swing inward on concealed hinges. Behind it lay a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Father had this built during the Indian troubles of the 70s, Elena explained as they entered the passage. "It connects to the courthouse basement and was designed to allow secure communication during emergencies." The tunnel was cramped and dusty, clearly unused for years, but it was structurally sound and led exactly where Elena had promised. They emerged in the courthouse basement, surrounded by stored records and unused furniture. Above them, they could hear the sound of footsteps as guards made their rounds. Judge Hartwell's private office was located on the second floor, accessible by a back stairway that would minimize their exposure to patrols. Marcus led the way, moving with the silent efficiency he had learned during night raids in his cavalry days. Every step was calculated, every shadow evaluated for concealment. The office door was locked, but Marcus's collection of frontier skills included basic lockpicking. Within minutes, they were inside the sanctum from which Judge Hartwell had orchestrated years of corruption and murder. The room was dominated by a massive desk covered with legal documents and correspondence. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large safe sat in one corner, its steel door decorated with the scales of justice, a symbol that had been perverted beyond all recognition. Elena moved directly to a particular filing cabinet, using a key she had taken from her father's personal effects. Inside were folders containing correspondence with railroad executives, land developers, and hired gunmen, a complete record of the conspiracy that had cost the Brennan family their lives. "Here," she said, pulling out a thick folder, "letters discussing property acquisition strategies, payments to hired killers, even a map showing which families have been targeted for elimination." Marcus examined the documents by lamplight, his jaw tightening as he read details of planned murders and property theft. The conspiracy was even larger than Elena had suspected, involving powerful interests from Denver and beyond. Judge Hartwell was not just a corrupt local official. He was part of a territorial network dedicated to eliminating anyone who stood in the way of railroad and mining development. "This is enough to hang your father and his associates," Marcus said, "but we need to get it to federal authorities before—" The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway cut him off. Multiple men were climbing the stairs, and their heavy treads suggested armed guards rather than casual patrol. Someone had discovered their presence in the building. "The window," Elena whispered, gathering as many documents as she could carry. "There's a fire ladder that reaches the ground." But as they moved toward the window, the sound of breaking glass came from below. Someone was smashing the courthouse windows to prevent their escape. They were trapped on the second floor with armed men blocking both the stairs and their planned exit route. "Miss Hartwell," came a familiar voice from the hallway, "I know you're in there. You and your mountain man friend have caused quite enough trouble." Judge Cornelius Hartwell had come to finish the job personally, and this time there would be no escape into the wilderness. But Elena clutched the stolen documents to her chest with grim satisfaction. Whatever happened next, the truth about the Brennan murders would survive to see justice done. The final confrontation was about to begin. Marcus moved to the office door and pressed his ear against the wood, listening to the sounds in the hallway. He could hear at least 4 distinct voices, including Judge Hartwell's authoritative tone, and what sounded like Deputy Marshal Jenkins directing the positioning of guards. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. "How many men does your father typically travel with?" Marcus whispered to Elena. "At least 6 armed guards, plus whatever deputies he could gather on short notice," she replied, still gathering documents from the filing cabinets. "But Marcus, we have what we came for. This correspondence proves everything. The planned murders, the property fraud, the conspiracy with railroad interests. Evidence doesn't matter if we're dead and the documents are destroyed," Marcus pointed out grimly. He examined the window Elena had mentioned, noting that it faced the main street where additional guards were probably positioned. The fire ladder she had referenced was visible, but using it would expose them to gunfire from multiple directions. "Miss Hartwell," Judge Hartwell's voice came through the door, calm and reasonable despite the circumstances. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to end this situation peacefully. Open the door, surrender the documents you've stolen, and I'll ensure your death is quick and merciful." "What about Marcus?" Elena called back. "Mr. Blackwood has interfered in matters that don't concern him. His fate was sealed the moment he chose to help you instead of minding his own business." Marcus checked his weapons one final time. His rifle had 4 rounds remaining, and his revolver was fully loaded. Against 6 or more armed men, it would have to be enough. But he was also thinking about the promise he had made to Elena, about exposing the truth, and about the children who had died screaming in their beds. "There might be another way," Elena said suddenly, moving to her father's desk and pulling out a particular drawer. "Father keeps emergency signal equipment here. Flares that can be seen for miles. If we could signal Dr. Morrison or someone else in town." "Your father's men control the street," Marcus pointed out. "Any signal would just bring more guards to surround the building." "Not necessarily." Elena held up a red flare with a knowing smile. "This particular signal was arranged with federal authorities in case Father ever needed to request immediate assistance with territorial emergencies. If we fire it from the courthouse roof, every honest lawman within 50 miles will come running." Marcus stared at her in amazement. "Your father arranged a way to call federal marshals?" "Ironically, yes. He wanted to maintain his reputation as a law and order judge who cooperated fully with territorial authorities." Elena moved toward a second stairway that led to the courthouse tower. "The signal is supposed to indicate that federal assistance is urgently needed due to criminal activity beyond local capacity to handle." "Which is exactly our situation," Marcus realized, "except we're the criminals your father can't handle." The plan that emerged was desperate but potentially brilliant. Elena would use her father's own emergency signal to call for federal intervention, while Marcus created enough of a distraction to prevent the guards from stopping her. If they could hold out until federal marshals arrived, the documents they had discovered would speak for themselves. The route to the courthouse tower took them through a narrow service stairway that was unguarded but would be vulnerable to attack once their movement was discovered. Marcus went first, rifle ready, while Elena followed with the stolen documents and signal flare. They had climbed 2 flights when the shooting started below them. Judge Hartwell had apparently grown impatient with negotiation and ordered his men to storm the office. The sound of splintering wood and shouted commands echoed up the stairwell as the guards discovered their quarry had moved to a new position. "There!" someone shouted. "They're heading for the tower!" Boots pounded on the stairs below them as pursuit began in earnest. Marcus turned and fired twice, his shots echoing in the confined space and apparently finding targets based on the cries of pain that followed. But more men were coming, and the narrow stairway would become a death trap once they were surrounded. Elena reached the tower room first, immediately moving to the window that faced the main street. The signal flare ignited with a brilliant red flame that cut through the darkness like a beacon, its light visible for miles across the surrounding valleys. She held it high, sweeping it back and forth in the pattern that would identify it as an official federal emergency signal. "It's done," she said, tossing the burned-out flare aside. "Now we wait and see if anyone responds." Marcus positioned himself at the top of the stairway, using overturned furniture to create a defensive position. The narrow approach would force attackers to come at him 1 or 2 at a time, negating their numerical advantage. But his ammunition was limited, and they would eventually overwhelm his position through sheer persistence. "Give up, Blackwood!" Judge Hartwell's voice echoed up the stairwell. "You're trapped with no way out. Surrender now, and I'll make sure Miss Hartwell's death is quick." "The same mercy you showed the Brennan children?" Marcus called back. The silence that followed was telling. Even surrounded by loyal guards and facing certain victory, Judge Hartwell couldn't bring himself to acknowledge his crimes aloud. The corruption he had built his power on required shadows and secrets, and Elena's courage in exposing the truth had dragged everything into the light. The first assault came minutes later, with 2 guards rushing up the stairs while others provided covering fire. Marcus's rifle spoke twice, and both men fell, but the attacks would continue until his ammunition was exhausted or federal help arrived, whichever came first. But as Marcus prepared for the next wave of attackers, a new sound reached his ears from the street below. The thunder of approaching horses and the calls of men who were definitely not Judge Hartwell's guards. Elena's signal had been seen and answered, and federal marshals were converging on the courthouse with the urgency that only an official emergency signal could command. "Federal marshals," came a voice from outside. "This building is now under federal authority. All armed personnel will lay down their weapons immediately." The transformation was almost magical. Within minutes, the sounds of combat were replaced by the voices of federal officers taking control of the situation. Judge Hartwell's guards, faced with the choice between certain death, fighting federal marshals, or surrender to face legal proceedings, chose survival. When Marcus and Elena finally descended from the tower, they found the courthouse filled with federal officers and the documents Elena had stolen being examined by territorial investigators. Judge Cornelius Hartwell sat in shackles, his face expressing the stunned disbelief of a man whose carefully constructed empire had collapsed in a single night. "The evidence is overwhelming," Marshal Thompson told them as dawn broke over Winter Haven. "These documents detail a conspiracy involving multiple murders, property fraud, and corruption that reaches all the way to Denver. Judge Hartwell and his associates will face federal charges that carry the death penalty." Elena stood beside her father's desk, looking at the man who had raised her, but who had revealed himself to be a monster. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said quietly, "but those children deserve justice." Judge Hartwell looked up at his daughter with eyes full of rage and betrayal. "You've destroyed everything I built, everything our family stood for." "No," Elena replied firmly. "I've restored what our family was supposed to stand for: justice, truth, and protection for the innocent." As federal marshals led Judge Hartwell away in chains, Elena turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "It's over. The Brennan children can finally rest in peace." Marcus nodded, understanding that their mountain journey had accomplished more than simple survival. They had proven that courage and determination could overcome even the most entrenched corruption, and that sometimes justice required ordinary people to take extraordinary risks. The woman he had found dying in the snow had whispered a secret that changed everything, and together they had ensured that the truth would never again be buried beneath the weight of power and influence. In the end, the woman Marcus Blackwood found dying in the Colorado snow proved that the most powerful weapon against corruption is not violence, but truth spoken by those brave enough to risk everything for justice. Elena Hartwell's courage in exposing her father's crimes didn't just save her own life. It saved countless others who would have fallen victim to Judge Hartwell's murderous conspiracy. The federal investigation that followed revealed a network of corruption spanning 3 territories, leading to dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen property. The Brennan family, along with other victims, finally received the justice they deserved, and the railroad development that had cost so many lives was forced to proceed through legal means rather than murder and fraud. Marcus returned to his mountain cabin a changed man, no longer hiding from human connection, but choosing solitude as a preference rather than a prison. Elena took a position with the territorial government, working to reform legal procedures and ensure that such widespread corruption could never again take root in Colorado's judicial system. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies or governments, but by ordinary people who refuse to let evil triumph through their silence. In a world where power often seems to protect the guilty, Elena and Marcus proved that truth and courage can still change everything. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have risked everything to help a stranger? Or would survival instinct have kept you safely uninvolved? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage and justice from America's frontier past, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Tomorrow we have another amazing tale that will remind you why doing the right thing, no matter the cost, is always worth the risk.